Ayşe Kadıoğlu is the moderator of the second panel, The Politics of Discrimination, Perceptions and Discourse. Between 2019 and 20, she worked for Sakıp Sabancı Center as a guest lecturer with Columbia University, Harvard University, Kennedy School of Government, Carl Center for Human Policy, and Harvard University are some of the centers where she lectured as a guest lecturer. And she also worked as an acting president for Sabancı University. It's over to you, Ayşe Hanım. Thank you very much. I'd like to start by referring to what Raquel Dink said in her opening speech. She referred to discriminatory discourse that may end up with murder and killings, and that's not even all. During the murder trials, it's as if perpetrators are kicking and jumping on the body they killed. They already killed. So this is a very striking example. Unfortunately, a discriminatory discourse is being normalized. It is like making malignity a normal thing. So I think this conference has a very, very important timing. Unfortunately, there is a rise of discriminatory discourse, and this conference brings together very important actors, and it's going to open new horizons, enable new discussions in this field. I know how meticulously the organizing committee have been working for preparing this conference, despite all the difficulties and difficult conditions. Thank you for projecting your positive energy thanks to this conference. I sincerely thank you very much for this positive energy. I'd like to turn to the first speaker of this panel, Türkay Salim Nefes, from Middle East Technical University Sociology Department. And she also has postgraduate degree in politics and sociology. Kent University Sociology Department is where she completed her doctoral studies. And she worked in postdoctoral positions abroad in prestigious universities. And Spanish Research Council is where she has been working as a researcher and consultant. She works on hostility between different groups, sociological theory, and the role of communication and pedagogical innovations. She is working on those fields. Türkay Nefes will be talking about negative perceptions of Jews in Turkish politics and analysis of parliamentary debates. She will be specifically focusing on the time period between 1983 and 2016. She will talk about the perception of threat and perceptions against Jews. So it's over to you, Türkay Salim Nefes.
Thank you very much, Professor Kadıoğlu, for introducing me. And thank you all for organizing this conference. I think this is my first online conference, so if I do any mistakes, I already apologize. And also another caveat before I start is basically, this is 8 a.m. in England, so I'm kind of like waking up through this talk. So apologies for that. And I will like to share my screen I will do like a short presentation of my research, but let me share my screen first. Here you go. Okay, I hope you can all see my screen now. Okay, basically my talk is on the perception of Jews in Turkish politics between 1983 and 2016. And basically, I'm not a fan of the feeling of suspense, so I will give you the conclusion. I will give you the takeaway message right now so that you know what is this all about. My research question is basically what factors do lead Turkish politicians to make negative remarks about Jews? And the answer is twofold. First, perceived national economic and religious threats incline politicians towards making negative comments. And being also, second, being from right-wing nationalist and Islamist ideological orientation also incline them towards making negative comments. So I will explain you how I came to this point. Basically, first I will briefly introduce the scholarship on the Turkish perception of Jews and show its gaps. And then I will talk about an alternative theoretical orientation that could help to fill those gaps, which is called group position theory, a substantial sociological perspective. And then I will explain in the second part of my presentation, I will explain my study, method, findings, and conclusions. To start it, the academic literature on the Turkish perception of Jews, we see a twofold like a picture there. One is very optimistic. It talks about anti-Semitism as a fringe aspect of Turkish society. And it tends to depict hospitable Turks and grateful Jews in its accounts. Basically like giving, giving individual examples from different contexts of history, particularly the Ottoman history, like the Bayezid II's invitation to expel Jews from Spain is one of the examples. For example, they tend to underline a lot. On the other hand, there's a literature on the Turkish perception, like there's a negative literature which mentions that Turkish Jews are the excluded category in Turkey. Basically, Turkish nationalism excluded non-Muslim Turk minorities. This literature also gives particular examples from different historical moments, like the Citizens Speak Turkish campaign in the early Republican period. Both literatures share one thing in common, which is they all focus on they tend to focus on individual events, like one event at a time. And the overall literature, therefore, lacks a generic theory that could explain us the anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish views in continuum, in time. So therefore, like my theoretical perspective helps to fill this gap by providing a generic theory. And I think group position theory, a substantial sociological perspective, could help us to fill that theoretical gap. Sorry. So group position theory, the main premise of group position theory is basically prejudice is triggered by the dominant group members' perception of outgroups as a threat to their privileges. So basically this theoretical perspective states that dominant groups like whites or like Turks or like whoever you could imagine feel that they are entitled to privileges, and once they feel any threat from any outgroup, they would be prejudiced against them. That's as simple as the perspective puts it. And most of the studies of this perspective focus on Western world and also anti-migrant movements and how individual members of the Western world feels about them. So it lacks macro level analysis of institutions and also from developing countries. So in that regard, my research also fills that gap in group position theory by introducing Turkish politics and how political parties describe Jews in Turkish politics as institutions. So, and how do I contextualize the group position theory to Turkish politics is basically through threat perception. How, like, basically the main premise here in my research is that when, I mean, apart from being right-wing nationalist and Islamist, also when politicians feel perceived threats, they would be more likely to describe Jews negatively in their talks. And that could be different forms of threats, perceived threats, like national threat. Like a national threat is most common national threat, as we all know, is the fear of dismemberment by the minorities and foreign powers in Turkey. Even like I give this example a lot, that even the first line of the Turkish national anthem starts with "Fear not," which kind of like almost hints that there is a fear. For the crimson flag that proudly ripples in its glorious twilight shall not fade. Basically saying that, don't worry, we are not going to be dismembered. And with regards to Jewish case, there is a literature on how Zionists want to dismember the country, which I might mention in my talk over the questions. And there could be also perceived religious threats from Judaism or economic threats by any Jewish person, the conspiracy theory about Jewish bankers, world domination. These kind of perceived threats could incline politicians towards making negative comments. We would argue relying on the group position theory. So what I did in my research is, with the help of a research assistant, basically we basically downloaded all the parliamentary records between 1983, Turkish parliamentary records between 1983 and 2016. And basically, we created a database of all the mentions of the word Jew in all speeches in the parliament. So there are 476 speeches we recorded that mention the word Jew. And then we created two main variables. One is perception, basically if they are perceived negatively or not. And the other one is basically debate topics. Basically, if in line with the group position theory, we said if the debate that politician is speaking about is about perceived threats, then we suggested that it might be basically incline them towards negative perception of Jews. So, and we analyzed the data using quantitative and qualitative content analysis. And before I go into the data, we also we did this separately. We coded the data separately and compared our codes, basically to understand, not to be subjective, because if I read something and if I think that it is negative about Jews, maybe somebody else might think differently. So what we did is basically, I and the research assistant separately coded the text, and now we compared our codes to ensure reliability of the analysis. So, and the main debates we analyzed are basically threat-related debates are Palestine conflict, Kurdish conflict, national security, economic corruption. And we paid special attention to these debates because they are related to the parliamentary debates that were related to perceived threats. But obviously there were other debates in which the word Jew was mentioned, like the tourism or history, education. And first, I ran a binary logistic regression analysis, basically to see to what extent there is in 476 talks, to what extent ideological orientation of the speaker and the perceived threats influence negative perception. And we found statistically significant relationship between ideological orientation, particularly being from right-wing political party, and talking about perceived threats as a predictor, as a significant predictor of talking negatively, describing Jews negatively. For example, if someone is talking about if a politician is talking about national security threats, he would be around 17 times more likely to talk negatively about Jews than if the same person talks in a
15 dakika uyarısı yapıyorum araya girip.
Sure. So basically, overall, the binary regression analysis showed us clearly that being right-wing and talking about any perceived threats inclined politicians to make negative comments about Jews. So, but we didn't stay there. We wanted to do this, we wanted to see how this works. So we did a qualitative analysis of each discussion about perceived threats. And I will give you some examples, for example, which are representative. For example, if a politician is talking about the Palestine conflict, and center-left political parties tend not to describe Jews negatively in those discussions. They tend to be critical to Israel, but not Jews. So they have a rather neutral stance against the Jewish identity. But when we go to the center-right, there's a mixed bag. So basically, some people also follow center-lefts, like a blaming of Israel, but not Jews, separating those two. But some also blame the Jewish identity. But when we go to the right wing, we see that actually the confirmation of the theoretical argument here, because right-wing political parties predominantly, if they are talking about Palestine conflict, predominantly blame Jews. So basically they kind of like, and they do that by relating Jewish identity to national and religious threats, which is kind of like a very in line with the group position theory. For example, Cevat Ayhan from the Welfare Party in 1990s said this when he was talking about Palestine conflict. He said, Muslims left Palestine to Jews, Bosnia to Serbs, and did not confront Europe, who is behind all these. Or another example, which is religious threat, another example is coming from a MDP, a nationalist party in the early 1980s. Rifat Bayezid said, Jews could invade here like what they did in Palestine. So you could clearly see that right wing is separately demonizing Jewish identity by seeing them or by viewing them as part of the perceived threats. And this picture is valid in all other discussions except the economic corruption, because in economic corruption, although economic threats, although it is quite negative view but it is all homogeneous, because most political parties share, and if they are talking about economic corruption, basically they share an negative perception of Jews all throughout different political parties. Being left-wing, center-right, or right-wing doesn't make much difference, and which could be due to the prevalence of this global kind of conspiratorial view about Jewish bankers controlling the world. But also on this topic, unlike the others, we have had less evidence. Nevertheless, basically, and this is pretty much our theoretical proposition that perceived national, economic, and religious threats incline political parties towards making negative remarks about Jews is basically confirmed by both qualitative and quantitative analysis. And also being right-wing nationalist and Islamist ideological orientation is also a very important factor in predicting this negative perception of Jews in the Turkish politics. And sorry, I just rushed through this, but I'm happy to answer any questions. And I think I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
Ayrımcılığın siyaseti algılar ve söylemler oturumunun ikinci konusu.
Thank you very much indeed. And now I would like to introduce the second speaker of our panel, Elif İrem Az. He's our second speaker. She is from the University of Columbia and PhD candidate. Following the Soma coal mine massacre, she has concentrated her studies on this issue. The economic vulnerabilities, the menial labor, the increasing inequalities are the subjects that she has been working on, both at local and at global level. In her previous studies, she worked on military masculinity, militarism as well. And she continues to work on the army, militarism, and social violence issues. And at the same time, she has compiled a poem collection. She continues her activities in New York and in Istanbul. So her speech is the performative force of the injurious discourse against the Soma coal miners. She has carried out fieldwork
in Soma, and she will be sharing with us. And she will also talk about the Judith Butler's injurious discourse, the hypothesis. So I'm very excited to listen to what İrem has to say. Thank you very much, Ms. Kadıoğlu. I would like to thank Hrant Dink Foundation and my former colleagues, being a former Hrant Dink Foundation employee myself. 6 months after the Soma coal mine disaster, in May 2016, almost about 3,000 mine workers received a text message, and they were informed that they are dismissed without any compensation rights. As a result, they started a march towards Ankara, and following a month-long watch and vigil, they were informed that they will be able to get their allowances, and to this end, legislation has been enacted, and this can be considered as the very first gain in labor movement since the 1980 coup d'etat. And this movement has inspired many laborers and coal miners, and there are so many organizations and trade unions established since 2018, including the Independent Miners Union. So a couple of weeks ago, Soma coal miners, the former workers of the Soma coal miners, ended their resistance, and they could finally get a word from the Ministry of Interior that they will be able to get their compensation pay after 14 years. And this movement made something visible, made the discourse against those coal miners, the injurious discourse against miners. So I could find hundreds of examples of injurious discourse after a quick check, and I could see that the Justice and Development Party, AKP, was the political party with the highest votes in Soma, and this was also a reason for the injurious discourse. And this injurious discourse came out with the contributions of so many people, including the local businesses in Soma, local and national journalists. Judith Butler, in her excitable speech, A Politics of the Performative book, she talks about the performative force of discourse. And this also relates to Austin's 1955 classes at Harvard University, How to Do Things with Words. So during these classes, Austin asked a question, would there be things through words? And then he answers yes. And Austin makes a distinction between explanatory words and performative expressions. And as a result, Austin concludes that some things happen through words, and in fact, they have real implications in the world. In other words, discriminatory or polarizing discourse is quite important to consider, because they also have the so-called illocutionary force, which considers the discourse as the ultimate truth. For one example, Austin gives is the pronouncing of husband and wife, because there is a question, do you accept one another as husband and wife? And the answer is yes, I accept. Another example is about personal promises we make, because our promises cannot be considered as right or wrong, because once a promise is made, it may not be kept, but this is not because the promise was itself wrongful or over time it became irrelevant. But of course, it is not possible to easily see the impact of the injurious discourse, because there are the others, Kurds, Armenians, LGBTI, as well as these working class who are making their lives with their labor, and they are also facing those humiliating, discriminatory, insulting, defamatory speech as well. That's the reason why injurious discourse cannot be reduced down to performative discourse or a performative utterance. Therefore, there is a different type of temporality than what Butler has already defined. All of these injurious discourses are in fact congealed or condensed forms of historicity. The more they are repeated and reproduced, there is a certain congelation, and it leads to a sedimentation of discourse. Today I'm talking about the Solo coal mine massacre or disaster. So this disaster did not only claim the lives of 301 coal miners, but this disaster also dramatically changed the interpersonal relationship of the people who survived this disaster. So in the field, I carried out various studies, but I will focus on two particular examples. I have met more than 100 people in Soma, the family members, the widowers, and they have made use of certain expressions that were judgmental or explanatory, and I'm using this based on Austin's classification. So everyone in Soma, including small business owners and shopkeepers, other people who are not in fact minors themselves, they used this discriminatory discourse. And as a result of the resistance, by the way, after the disaster, there was an increase in the pay of the mine workers, which also created some sort of rage among the non-coal miners. So that also brought along another wave of discriminatory discourse that these miners are getting a lot of pay. And the same goes for the widowers of the miners who lost their lives in the disaster. So if they accepted the compensation after the disaster, the widowers are portrayed as evil women, that they live by the compensation, or they got the compensation and now they keep their mouth shut. So also this situation gave rise to a problem in the personal relationship, because some of the women do no longer live with the families of their deceased husbands. And the women themselves that I have talked to, they have expressed that they find this discriminatory discourse quite unfair, and there's also a discourse that people, now that they have got the money, now that they have got the compensation, everything has got out of their head. So some of that also partially agreed with those criticism. And secondly, a second example, the discourse in Soma was also influenced after the general elections in 2015. And this mostly surrounded around the criticism that despite the disaster for which the AKP government was responsible, the Soma people, the coal miners, kept voting for the same party. And this can be also likened to the situation in the US under Trumpism and the what happened in the coal pit in Appalachia region. Overall, in my research, I could see how this injurious discourse is reproduced and how it influences the daily lives of people, especially the family members of the Soma miners who lost their lives in the disaster. And the ones who produce this discourse are apparently not happy with the current political climate, and they try to put the burden on the families of Soma coal miners. And they also make a distinction between the economic working class and the socio-cultural capital. So, as I have already explained, these injurious discourse both circulates within Soma district itself, and it can also come from our outside, but both have significant impact on their targets. And meanwhile, let me show you a number of examples. So injurious discourse is not used to replace another form of violence, but injurious discourse is a form of violence in its own right. And injurious discourse is always a concentrated form of some historicity. And the people, the widowers who continue to live with the families of the coal miners are still being named as brides, and they are still being labeled as the voters of the AKP. And these are all to do with the historicity of the issue. But as we all know, in Soma, we need to also look into the historical background. Previously, this used to be an agricultural field, but together with the 1980 coup d'etat, with the neoliberal agricultural policies, the agricultural activities has to come to an end, and the coal mine has gained prominence, especially with the AKP government. And that's why more and more people could find employment in the coal mine, and hence more and more people kept voting for the AKP. So these are all parts of the big picture that we need to keep in mind. And it is through this discourse that we injure those people, judging them based on the political party that they are voting for. And this creates a social trauma. And this social trauma is reproduced and revived with each and every new discourse. So the Soma coal mine disaster was a shocking one. It completely detached people from their own reality and context, and coupled with the injurious discourse, we have to ask these following questions. What have you done to gain the knowledge of the disaster, as Maurice Blanchot asked in the writings of the disaster? So we have to keep asking this question. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Irem, and I will introduce our third speaker now. Our third speaker is Stephen Aiello, and he received his undergraduate degree in economics at New York University and graduate degree in diplomacy and conflict studies at the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya, Israel. He's an educator and conflict resolution specialist based in Tel Aviv, and he founded a Debate for Peace in 2016, which has engaged 2,000 students from 100 cities and towns. He's an honorary advisor for the NGO Committee on Sustainable Development, project officer and dialogue expert at ASFAR in Israel, and the head of the Model UN program, United Nations program at the Academy for Young Diplomats. His paper is titled Empathy Storytelling, and he will talk to us about a storytelling project called Empathy. In a way, he's going to portray to us how to grapple the issue of discriminatory discourse, how to basically provide solutions to that. And this is a project. The project called Empathy is a project geared towards overcoming discrimination through empathy, respect, listening, and understanding. Stephen, floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for organizing this important conference. I've been to Turkey several times, and I really look forward to visiting again. So I just want to quote I want to start with the famous quote, the only thing, or paraphrase of the quote, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. And for me as an educator and a peace activist, it's important that we not just talk about the problem, but also what those who are concerned about it, can do about the problem. And it was just 2 or 3 weeks ago that the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights spoke at the UN on the topic of hate speech, social media, and minorities, and noted the need for proactive steps by all citizens to speak out against hate speech and also research the root cause to hate speech. So for me, the root cause, or one of the main causes for hate speech, is simply lack of exposure. I know this from personal experience because I grew up in a very sheltered Jewish community in Brooklyn, New York. And it was about the age of 19 or 20 when I first was able to overcome many biases that I had, not from any malice, but just from lack of exposure. And when I moved to Israel 10 years ago, I found a society here that's extremely divided. I'm working with youth between the ages of 14 to 18 or 19. And we're facing the kind of barriers that are geographical, living in different cities, linguistic, speaking different languages, religious, cultural, and of course we have the political conflict overshadowing everything. And so the question was, how can we bring the kind of positive exposure that will overcome the otherness, the biases that can lead to discrimination and hate speech in society? And so what I want to present today are 2 powerful tools that have worked for us here, but that I think can be scaled, can be modified, can be used in all kinds of other contexts and all kinds of other conflicts. So actually the first one I'll start with is Model United Nations. Model United Nations, MUN, many may be familiar. It's popular in the United States, in Europe, in Turkey. It's a game, it's a simulation where students are role-playing, they're representing countries, and they're dealing with usually the same topics that the United Nations might be dealing with. It could be a conflict somewhere, it could be how to empower women, it could be how to address poverty via technology, and it's what we call collaborative competition or competitive collaboration. So students are often competing for awards, but they're trying to do it by gaining the support of their peers to solve global problems. Now, what I've done is to take that and use that as a framework for bringing Jewish and Palestinian students together. And I just want to speak briefly about some of the advantages for using MUN, because people understand MUN as a tool for learning about international relations or debate, but they don't always grasp the advantages it has for peace education and for overcoming stereotypes. So the first thing is that it's rules-based. So there's a system of rules, there's a framework. It's not just a free-for-all. And that makes entering difficult topics and conversations really much more easy. The role-playing aspect, the fact that I can assign students to represent a certain topic, that a certain position that they don't necessarily agree with, but everyone in the room knows that they're doing their best to represent that position, and they need to try to understand that position to succeed. So it really encourages stepping out of your own 2 shoes and trying to see someone else's perspective. It's diverse, so it's a national or an international program, so automatically offers the chances to do something outside of your school, your community, your city, and to meet people who are different. But at the same time, the focus is on the conference itself. So it's not about the person next to you being different. It's about the fact that you're all there to try to engage the same problems. It's egalitarian, so that linguistically we do it in English, which means that we overcome the issues with Hebrew and Arabic. Everyone's kind of struggling on an equal footing. And it's problem solving. And what I want to focus on for educators is that this is a flexible tool, meaning don't feel like you need to stick to someone else's rules for a specific conference. You can adjust the rules. You can adjust the topics. So we allow students to suggest topics they need. That's allowed us to talk about things like LGBT issues that's a concern for more students from more conservative communities, or talking about racism, talking about religious extremism. We can choose the topics, and we can have students choose the topics, which empowers the students themselves. It gives them a sense of agency, empowerment. And of course, we have repeated interactions. So we have conferences that happen one after another, which gives students a chance to meet and build up friendships. And finally, there's a focus on collaboration and communication. So it's not just meeting someone for a cup of coffee or playing sports. It's we can solve problems, but only if we talk together and we listen to each other and we try to find a middle ground. Now, they may start with global issues, but we can bring that to local issues. And so to give just some examples here, we've taken on really the most controversial topics in the Israeli-Palestinian context. And the students have not just discussed it, but they've actually come to consensus-based resolutions and agreements. We've talked about the nation-state law, which passed a few years ago here, which was very controversial and perceived as discriminating against minorities. We've had students offer their recommendations for how to educate for peace. We've done simulations of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, which almost always end in an actual agreement, each agreement a little bit different, proving that there are many pathways to peace. We talk about Jerusalem, religion and extremism. And what students have said is that they feel a safe space to talk about the issues that even in their own communities, they don't feel comfortable to talk about. Here they can talk about it with people who disagree because it's such a safe, friendly, respectful environment. So that's a little bit about Model UN. And again, what I want to emphasize, whether you use MUN before or never used it, don't feel like you need to be stuck to specific rules of procedure or topics. You can absolutely take the framework and use it as a tool to talk about whatever local issue is challenging your community or your students. So that's Model UN. I am going to share screen just to show very few photos. So it's really just the students, sitting here meeting from all different communities. And I want to move to the second tool, which is something that's a bit unique. It's built on something that some educators may also be familiar with, which is called empathy storytelling. We got support from the Robert Bush Foundation and the American Embassy here. And what empathy storytelling did is it tried to tackle the topic of refugees. Refugees, along with Jerusalem, is one of the two big topics from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that no one's ever been able to address. It's the Nobel $1 Million Prize winner, right? If you can address this, because Palestinian refugees is a huge issue for Palestinians, and Jews in Israel, by and large, do not feel comfortable with Palestinian refugees returning, and so they don't actually feel comfortable discussing the topic itself. Even just talking about the topic is kind of triggering for many Israeli Jews. And so what we did was we tried to pair students together and to say, what if you learn each other's stories? So there are many Jewish refugees or students whose parents or grandparents came to Israel from different countries. And so we took 4 pairs of students, one Jewish and one Arab, who all had a family background, a family heritage of having left their hometown, forced out of their homes, being refugees. And we paired them together, and their assignment was, you have to tell the other person's story. And if you think about it, it's one thing to listen to a story, but when you have to tell someone else's story, you have to really know the story well. You have to really hear it and listen to it, and again, step into the person's shoes. And every time you tell it, you live it, you experience the story. And the students had the opportunity to go and meet the family members and talk to the oldest living family member and hear the story personally. And so we've done empathy storytelling for 2 years now, 2 cohorts. Every single story is extremely special, extremely powerful. Again, Palestinians whose uncles were shot, whose families spent years traveling until they could find a home. Jews who were chased by Nazis, who fled Morocco, Iraq, Yemen. And the students, the Jewish and Arab students, every single one said that they came closer together. They became friends through hearing the other stories. So we were able to take an issue which is really one of the most triggering topics in a fairly divisive conflict. And through a respectful framework of listening and then storytelling, we were able to make it actually something that brought students together. They felt close afterwards. They can both be social and talk about the political issues they disagree with, because they have this deep connection. Students were crying when they heard their friends telling one another stories. I can't show it here, but if you go onto YouTube afterwards or just connect for Debate for Peace, you can see the stories. Some of the stories are recorded on YouTube. I'm just going to show a few more photos from the Empathy Storytelling Project, and then I'm going to leave the time so we have more time for questions. Okay. And so you see here, you're celebrating holidays together, Jewish and Muslim holidays, iftar. And then a Jewish student from Iraqi heritage who goes to visit his Bedouin partner's home. And this is when we presented in Netherlands and we presented at the Anne Frank House. So again, thank you very much. And I'll stop here so that we have time for the questions.
Okay, thank you, Stephen.